It was supposed to be a routine day for John, a seasoned taxi driver with a long career on the road. But when he chose to ignore a young black man flagging him down, Miss C9D, dismissing him without a second thought, he had no idea that this moment would change everything. Little did John know that the man he refused would soon sit in his back seat, and what unfolded next would shock him in ways he never imagined, especially when he realized just who the man was. But first, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this tale, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's special story. John had been a taxi driver for nearly 2 decades. Over time, his once optimistic view of the world had soured, hardening into a cynical, bitter outlook. He'd seen all kinds of passengers, from well-dressed business people to tired night shift workers. But over the years, John had begun making assumptions about people based solely on their appearance, and it shaped how he treated them. This was especially true when it came to black passengers. John wasn't overtly racist, or so he thought. He believed his judgments were based on years of experience, of seeing the worst behavior from those he claimed to know best. To him, refusing service to black people was just another form of self-preservation. He had long convinced himself that it wasn't about race, but about avoiding trouble. It was a mindset he had developed without ever realizing how deeply it was rooted in prejudice. This particular afternoon was no different. John's shift had been long, and he was ready to finish up for the day. He'd had a couple of difficult passengers, including a man who had argued over the fare, and another who had spilled coffee all over the back seat without an apology. So when he saw a young black man flagging him down, his immediate instinct was to pass him by. Marcus Taylor stood on the curb, dressed in jeans and a casual shirt, exuding an air of quiet confidence. At 26, Marcus was already a successful entrepreneur, though you wouldn't have guessed it from his relaxed appearance. He had just finished a series of meetings and was ready to head back to his apartment. As Marcus raised his hand to flag John down, John glanced at him through the windshield and felt a wave of judgment wash over him. Without even considering who Marcus might be, John muttered to himself, "Not today," and kept driving, leaving Marcus standing on the street corner. Marcus wasn't surprised. He had faced this kind of treatment before, too many times to count. In fact, he had experienced subtle and overt racism throughout his life, from shopkeepers following him around stores to security guards assuming he was up to no good. This moment was just another reminder of the biases that still existed, even in the most everyday situations. But Marcus wasn't one to get angry over these encounters. He had learned long ago that anger rarely changed anything. Instead, he calmly pulled out his phone and ordered a taxi through an app, hoping his next driver wouldn't share the same assumptions as the first. As fate would have it, the app dispatched John once again. Unaware that Marcus had been the man he passed earlier, John accepted the ride. When he pulled up to the pickup location and saw Marcus approaching, his initial reaction was to think of an excuse to refuse him again. But before John could even open his mouth, Marcus walked confidently toward the car, opened the door and got in, giving John no chance to refuse. "Good evening," Marcus said, his voice calm but direct. "Could you take me downtown to the office towers?" John felt a surge of unease. He glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror, noticing the way he sat comfortably in the back seat, as if he belonged there. The quiet confidence Marcus exuded unsettled John even more. "You got business down there?" John asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Marcus didn't react to the undertone. "Yes," he replied simply, turning his attention to his phone. John, still feeling uncomfortable, gripped the steering wheel tighter as they pulled away from the curb. His mind raced with assumptions. A black man going downtown to the office towers? That didn't seem right to him. In John's world, someone like Marcus had no business being in the heart of the city's financial district. The silence in the cab was heavy, broken only by the occasional sound of traffic. John couldn't resist the urge to probe further. "Not many young guys like you work in those fancy offices," John said, keeping his eyes on the road but glancing up occasionally in the rearview mirror to gauge Marcus's reaction. Marcus looked up from his phone, meeting John's gaze in the mirror with a calm, measured expression. "What do you mean, guys like me?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but challenging. John hesitated, realizing he had walked into dangerous territory. He didn't want to outright admit his bias, but he wasn't sure how to backtrack without revealing it. "You know," he muttered, "just young guys. Not many work in those big offices." Marcus gave a small smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. He saw right through John's veiled statement. Instead of responding further, Marcus went back to his phone, leaving John to sit in uncomfortable silence for the rest of the ride. The office tower came into view, and John's unease only grew. This was one of the most prestigious buildings in the city, home to some of the most influential companies and wealthiest individuals. John couldn't believe that Marcus had any legitimate reason to be there. He pulled up to the curb, expecting Marcus to get out and disappear into the crowd. But before Marcus stepped out of the car, he turned to John and handed him a business card. "I'll need a ride back in a few minutes," Marcus said as he stepped out of the car. "Wait here for me." John took the card, his hand trembling slightly as he looked down at it. His heart skipped a beat as he read the name. Marcus Taylor, CEO and founder, Taylor Enterprises. In that moment, everything fell into place for John. This wasn't just any passenger. Marcus wasn't some random guy who had no business being in the financial district. He was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. And John had not only passed him by earlier, but had spent the entire ride making condescending comments about where he belonged. John sat frozen in the driver's seat, his mind racing. He had made a terrible mistake. John sat in his taxi, the business card still in his hand, his mind spinning. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the name on the card. Marcus Taylor, CEO and founder, Taylor Enterprises. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The man he had judged so quickly, the man he had passed by without a second thought, was actually one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the city. For a moment, John considered leaving, just driving away and pretending the whole thing never happened. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything. Besides, Marcus had asked him to wait, and leaving now would make everything worse. He was stuck. As he sat there, his thoughts started racing. What was Marcus going to do? Would he report John to the taxi company? Could he lose his job over this? John had a family to support, and while driving a taxi wasn't the glamorous career he'd once envisioned, it was his livelihood. The idea of losing it over a stupid split-second judgment terrified him. John fidgeted with the business card, flipping it over in his hands as the minutes dragged on. His mind was filled with regret. Why hadn't he just picked Marcus up in the first place? Why did he have to make that snide comment about guys like him working in fancy offices? The more he thought about it, the worse he felt. He glanced at the office tower, hoping to see Marcus emerging so they could get this over with. But Marcus hadn't come out yet, and John's anxiety continued to grow. His thoughts turned darker as he imagined the worst-case scenario. Marcus reporting him, the taxi company firing him, and him having to explain to his wife and kids why he'd lost his job. He couldn't let that happen. But what could he do? Apologize? Beg for forgiveness? John wasn't the type to grovel, but he wasn't sure he had a choice. This wasn't just some minor passenger complaint. Marcus had power, real power, and John had no idea what Marcus planned to do with it. John was startled out of his thoughts when the car door suddenly opened and Marcus slid back into the passenger seat. His expression was calm, unreadable, and that made John even more nervous. "Ready to go?" Marcus asked, his tone casual, as if nothing unusual had happened. John swallowed hard and nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he pulled away from the curb. The silence in the car was suffocating, and John knew he had to say something, anything, to try to fix the situation. "Listen, about earlier," John began, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean anything by it. I didn't know who you were." Marcus glanced up from his phone, meeting John's eyes in the rearview mirror. "Didn't mean anything by what?" John felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He didn't know how to answer without making things worse. "You know," he stammered, "when I passed you by earlier and, well, the comment I made in the car, I didn't realize, that I'm black?" Marcus cut in, his voice calm but sharp. John's stomach lurched. No, it's not that," he blurted out, scrambling to explain himself. "I just didn't know you were, important." Marcus didn't say anything for a long moment, his eyes still locked on John's in the mirror. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady and controlled. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect." John's heart sank. He knew Marcus was right. He had let his biases dictate his actions, and now he was paying the price. He could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him, and there was nothing he could say to justify it. "I'm sorry," John said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I really am." Marcus didn't respond. He simply went back to looking at his phone, leaving John to stew in his guilt for the rest of the ride. The silence was unbearable. Every second felt like an hour, and John's mind raced with panic. Was Marcus going to report him after all? Was this it? His career, his livelihood, all gone because of one moment of stupidity? John's stomach churned as he pulled up in front of Marcus's apartment building. He stopped the car and waited, unsure of what to expect. He could feel his pulse in his throat, and he was dreading whatever might come next. Marcus didn't say anything as he opened the door and stepped out of the taxi. He stood there for a moment, then leaned down and looked at John through the open window. "Do better," Marcus said simply before closing the door and walking away. John sat there, frozen, watching as Marcus disappeared into the building. He felt like he had just been punched in the gut. Those two words, "do better," hit him harder than any angry outburst ever could. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Marcus wasn't going to report him. He wasn't going to try to get him fired. Instead, he had given John a second chance, a chance to reflect on his actions and change his ways. But as John sat there in his car, staring at the building where Marcus had vanished, he wasn't sure if he could. John sat there for several long minutes, still gripping the steering wheel as though it were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. His mind replayed Marcus's final words. Do better. He had expected punishment, maybe even a scolding or a formal complaint. But instead, Marcus had left him with those two words, words that were harder to process than any harsh rebuke. They weren't just a reprimand. They were a challenge, a call to change. The weight of it settled on John, and for the first time in a long time, he felt ashamed. He wasn't the kind of man who usually reflected on his behavior. He had built up so many walls over the years, convincing himself that his judgments were justified, that he was only being practical. But now those walls were crumbling. As he drove away from Marcus's building, John's thoughts spiraled. He had always believed that the world was a tough place and that he needed to look out for himself. But was that really true? Was it really self-preservation that made him treat people like Marcus with such disdain? Or was it something darker? He had never thought of himself as racist. After all, he didn't go around shouting slurs or engaging in overt acts of hate. But wasn't what he had done just as harmful? He had judged Marcus without knowing anything about him, simply because of his appearance. He had assumed the worst, and in doing so, he had revealed the worst parts of himself. John's stomach churned as the realization hit him. This wasn't just about one interaction with Marcus. It was about years of behavior, years of dismissing people, of avoiding difficult truths, of pretending that his actions didn't have consequences. The drive back to the taxi company was a blur. John's hands shook on the wheel, and his heart felt heavy in his chest. He tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to Marcus's face, to the way he had calmly but firmly called John out. It wasn't anger that had unsettled him. It was Marcus's quiet strength, his refusal to let John's behavior slide without addressing it. When John pulled into the lot at the end of his shift, he sat in the car for a moment, staring blankly out the windshield. He wasn't sure what to do next. Part of him wanted to forget the whole thing, to brush it off and go back to his normal routine. But another part of him knew that he couldn't, at least not if he wanted to keep any shred of self-respect. As he stepped out of the car and headed toward the dispatcher's office, John's mind continued to race. He thought about Marcus, about his quiet confidence, and the way he had handled the situation with such grace. Marcus could have humiliated him, could have made a scene, but instead he had given John a chance to reflect. John walked into the office, handing in his keys and logging out for the day. His body felt heavy, as if he were carrying a burden he didn't know how to lift. He exchanged a few brief words with the dispatcher, then made his way out of the building. The walk to his own car felt like a march towards some inevitable reckoning. He couldn't stop thinking about the consequences of his actions, not just today, but over the years. How many people had he judged unfairly? How many times had he refused someone a ride based on his own prejudices? For the first time, John was forced to confront the reality of who he had become. He had always seen himself as a man just doing his job, looking out for himself in a tough world. But now he wasn't so sure. Maybe he had been wrong all along. Maybe the world wasn't as tough as he thought. Maybe he was the one who had hardened himself against it. When John finally got into his own car, he sat there for a long time, staring at the dashboard. The silence was suffocating, but he didn't turn on the radio. He needed to sit with the discomfort, to face the truth he had been avoiding for so long. Marcus had given him a chance to do better. But could he? John drove home in silence, his mind a whirl of emotions. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw his wife's car parked outside, a familiar comfort that usually brought a sense of relief after a long day. But tonight, it only made him feel more burdened. He knew he couldn't walk into his home without acknowledging what had happened. He couldn't face his family without first facing himself. He sat in the car for a few more minutes, gathering his thoughts. How was he supposed to explain any of this? Should he even try? Would anyone understand? With a deep sigh, John finally opened the car door and stepped out. As he walked toward the house, he felt the weight of the day pressing down on him, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he could handle it. John stood at the front door for a moment, his hand resting on the handle. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the heaviness that clung to him, but the weight of what had happened earlier refused to lift. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the kind of person he had allowed himself to become over the years. When he finally pushed the door open, the familiar warmth of home washed over him. The faint smell of dinner lingered in the air, and he could hear the soft hum of the television from the living room. Normally, coming home was a relief after a long day, a place where he could escape the stresses of work and forget about the world for a little while. But tonight, the house felt different. It felt like the walls were closing in, the silence pressing down on him, even with the background noise of his family's routine. John's wife, Linda, was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Hey, you're home early?" she said, her voice light. "How was your day?" John forced a smile, though it felt unnatural. "Long," he muttered, setting his keys down on the counter. Linda raised an eyebrow, sensing something off. "You okay?" she asked, her tone shifting to one of concern. John hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He didn't want to get into it. Not yet. Not when he hadn't even fully processed it himself. "Yeah, just tired," he said quickly, hoping to avoid the conversation. Linda studied him for a moment but didn't press further. "Dinner's still warm if you're hungry." "Maybe later," John replied, his stomach too tied in knots to think about food. He walked into the living room, where his teenage son, Eric, was sprawled out on the couch, phone in hand, half watching a basketball game on the TV. Eric glanced up briefly as John entered, then went back to his screen without a word. John sat down in his favorite chair, the one he always retreated to after a long day, but tonight it didn't bring the usual comfort. The weight of the day's events still lingered heavily in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of Marcus sitting in the back seat, staring at him through the rearview mirror, calmly confronting him with his own prejudice. For a long time, John just sat there, lost in thought, the noise of the game and the occasional commentary from Eric fading into the background. He replayed the conversation in his mind over and over again, the way Marcus had challenged him with such quiet strength. He remembered the words Marcus had left him with. "Do better." John knew that Marcus hadn't just meant. In that one moment, he had been talking about something bigger, something deeper. Marcus had given John an opportunity to reflect, to change, but as John sat in the dim light of the living room, he wasn't sure if he could. After so many years of living a certain way, of seeing the world through a narrow lens, was it even possible to change? He glanced over at Eric, who was still absorbed in his phone, oblivious to the turmoil going on in his father's mind. John thought about the example he had been setting for his son all these years. What kind of man had he shown Eric to be? A man who made snap judgments about people? A man who avoided difficult truths because they made him uncomfortable? John felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had always wanted to teach Eric the value of hard work and resilience. But what about kindness? What about fairness and respect? Had he ever really shown his son those qualities? As if sensing his father's gaze, Eric glanced up from his phone. "You good, Dad?" he asked, his tone casual, but with a hint of curiosity. John hesitated. "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied, though the words felt hollow. He wanted to say more, to explain what was weighing on him, but he didn't know where to begin. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? Eric shrugged and went back to his phone, the moment passing as quickly as it had come. John leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment, but the thoughts wouldn't stop. He couldn't escape the fact that something had shifted in him today, something he couldn't ignore. Later that evening, after everyone had gone to bed, John found himself sitting at the kitchen table, the house quiet around him. He stared out the window into the dark night, his mind still churning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Marcus's business card, flipping it over in his hand once again. The name stared back at him, a reminder of the man who had challenged him in ways he hadn't expected. Marcus hadn't yelled or berated him. He hadn't demanded retribution. Instead, he had left John with the hardest task of all, facing himself. John set the card down on the table and rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the weight of his exhaustion. But it wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, the weight of a lifetime of choices, of beliefs that had gone unquestioned for far too long. He thought about Marcus again, about the way he had handled the situation with such grace. He thought about how different things could have gone if Marcus had been someone else, someone who reacted with anger or resentment. But Marcus hadn't done that. Instead, he had offered John something far more valuable than any reprimand, a chance to change. But could he? Could John really change after all these years? He wasn't sure. John woke up the next morning feeling like he hadn't slept at all. The events of the previous day had weighed on him all night, and even as the sun rose and the world outside came to life, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. He moved through his morning routine in a daze, his mind elsewhere as he showered, dressed, and grabbed his keys. His wife, Linda, gave him a concerned look as he headed out the door. "You sure you're okay?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine worry. John paused for a moment, considering telling her everything that was on his mind, but he wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. He didn't even know how to put it into words. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, giving her a forced smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Linda nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "Okay, just let me know if you need to talk." "I will," John promised, though he wasn't sure when or if that talk would happen. As he drove toward the taxi company, John's thoughts kept drifting back to Marcus. He had spent hours turning the situation over in his mind, questioning everything he had once believed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how deep his biases went. It wasn't just about one interaction or one moment of prejudice. It was about years of living in a way that had pushed people like Marcus to the margins, people John had never really seen until now. The ride to the taxi depot felt longer than usual, the familiar streets passing by in a blur as John's mind raced. When he finally arrived, he parked his car and sat there for a moment, staring at the entrance to the building. His chest felt tight, and he wondered if he was on the verge of a panic attack. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wasn't sure how he was supposed to go back to work after what had happened. Could he just pretend everything was normal, pick up passengers, and continue as if nothing had changed? The thought felt unbearable. But what was the alternative? Quitting? That wasn't an option either. He had a family to support, and quitting wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't erase what he had done or who he had become. Reluctantly, John grabbed his work keys and headed inside. The familiar routine of checking in and getting his taxi for the day felt robotic, like he was just going through the motions. He nodded at a few coworkers, exchanged the usual pleasantries, but it all felt hollow. He couldn't stop thinking about Marcus. As John pulled out of the lot and started his shift, the city felt different. It was the same streets, the same traffic, the same people rushing to work or school, but something in John had shifted. He saw the world through a different lens now, one that made him question every interaction, every assumption he had ever made. The first few fares of the day were uneventful. A couple of quick rides to the train station, a quiet passenger heading to a doctor's appointment, nothing out of the ordinary. But John couldn't help but notice how differently he saw his passengers now. He wondered how many times he had judged people based on their appearance, how many times he had dismissed someone without even realizing it. By midday, John was feeling the weight of it all. His mind was a constant loop of questions, guilt, and self-reflection. He pulled into a quiet spot by the park and decided to take a break. He sat in the driver's seat, staring out at the trees and people walking by, lost in thought. John couldn't help but think about his own life, his own choices. How had he become this person? When had he stopped caring about people as individuals and started seeing them as just another fare? He had always prided himself on being a good, hardworking man, but now he wasn't so sure. Was he really a good man if he treated people the way he had treated Marcus? The more John thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about Marcus. It was about all the passengers he had judged over the years, all the people he had turned away because they didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable. He thought about the missed opportunities to connect with people, to be kind, to show respect. Instead, he had built walls around himself, walls that kept him isolated and bitter. John's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a new fare request, another passenger needing a ride. He sighed, starting the engine and pulling out of the parking spot. The address wasn't far, just a few blocks away, and when John arrived, he saw a young woman standing on the sidewalk, looking down at her phone. She was black, dressed in professional clothes, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. For a moment, John felt the familiar stir of judgment in his mind, the old habits trying to resurface. But he caught himself. After a few minutes of driving, the man spoke up. "You been driving a long time?" he asked, his voice gravelly but not unfriendly. John glanced at him in the rearview mirror, surprised by the question. "Yeah, about 20 years now," he replied. "Seen just about everything." The man nodded, leaning back in his seat. "I bet you have. A lot of people coming and going, a lot of stories." John wasn't sure where the conversation was going, but he nodded in agreement. "Yeah, you could say that." The man fell silent again, and for a while they drove in silence. But there was something about the man's words that stuck with John. A lot of people coming and going, a lot of stories. It reminded him of something he had been trying to avoid thinking about. How many stories had he missed over the years? How many people had he judged before ever getting to know them? John had always thought of himself as a good judge of character, someone who could size people up at a glance. But now he wasn't so sure. Maybe he had been wrong about a lot of things. As they approached the man's destination, John couldn't shake the feeling that this ride, like the others today, was another chance, another opportunity to change the way he thought, to see people as individuals with their own stories, rather than as stereotypes or assumptions. When they arrived, the man handed John the fare and paused before getting out of the car. He looked at John for a moment, as if he were about to say something, then simply nodded. "Take care of yourself," the man said before stepping out and walking away. John sat there for a moment, watching the man disappear into the building. Something about the interaction had unsettled him, but he wasn't sure why. It wasn't anything the man had said. It was the reminder that people like him, like Marcus, like the young woman from earlier, all had their own stories, their own experiences that John had been blind to for so long. With a deep breath, John pulled away from the curb and headed back into the city. The day was winding down, but his thoughts were still churning. He knew this journey of self-reflection wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But he had taken the first steps, and that was something. As John continued driving through the late afternoon, the city around him seemed to blur into the background. His mind was consumed by thoughts of the past few days, the faces of his passengers blurring with the weight of his growing self-awareness. The man he had just dropped off seemed ordinary enough, yet his presence lingered in John's mind. "Son," what had stuck with John most was the man's final words, "Take care of yourself." It seemed like a simple goodbye, but the way he had said it left John unsettled. Was he taking care of himself? His life, his actions, his beliefs, they all felt like they were unraveling. It was as if everything he had built his life around had been called into question, and he didn't know where to go from here. The rest of his shift passed quietly, with a few uneventful fares here and there. John kept to himself, picking up and dropping off passengers, each ride blurring into the next. He was too preoccupied to engage in conversation, his mind still wrestling with everything he'd come to realize about himself. When John's shift finally ended, he parked the taxi back at the depot, turning in his keys to the dispatcher. He had a strange feeling of exhaustion that went beyond the physical. It was a weariness that came from the emotional strain of facing parts of himself he had long ignored. He walked to his car, the silence of the parking lot pressing down on him. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement, and for the first time, John felt small, like a man who had been living in a world far larger than he had ever allowed himself to see. As he drove home, he replayed his earlier interactions with Marcus in his mind. The way Marcus had looked at him in the rearview mirror, calm yet firm. The way Marcus had given him a second chance without anger, without punishment, but with a challenge to do better. John wondered if he was up to that challenge. He wanted to believe he could change, but it felt overwhelming. Was it really possible to undo years of ingrained habits and beliefs? Could he truly become a different person? By the time he pulled into his driveway, the sky had darkened. The house looked warm and inviting, the lights glowing through the front windows. Normally, John would have felt a sense of relief upon arriving home, but tonight he just felt empty. As he walked through the front door, he was greeted by the usual sounds of home, his son Eric playing a video game in the living room, Linda in the kitchen preparing dinner. The normalcy of it all felt jarring to John, as if the world had continued moving while he was stuck in place, grappling with things no one else could see. Linda looked up from the stove as John entered the kitchen. "You're home right on time," she said with a smile. "Dinner will be ready in a few minutes." John nodded absently, but his mind was elsewhere. He sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the patterns in the wood grain as his thoughts churned. "You've been quiet lately," Linda said after a moment, her voice gentle but curious. "You want to talk about it?" John looked up at her, feeling the weight of her question. He hadn't told her about what had happened with Marcus, hadn't mentioned the deep internal struggle he'd been going through. How could he explain something so complex, something that he himself was still trying to understand? "I don't know," John admitted, running a hand through his hair. "It's just, work's been different lately. I've been thinking a lot." Linda set down the spoon she was using to stir the pot and walked over to sit across from him at the table. "What's been on your mind?" she asked, her expression soft and open, the way it always was when she knew something was bothering him. John hesitated, unsure of how to begin. He had always been a man who kept his thoughts to himself, who prided himself on being self-reliant. But now, with everything that had happened, he felt like he was drowning under the weight of it all. There was this passenger, John finally said, his voice quiet. He was young, black, successful. I didn't pick him up at first because, I don't know, I just made assumptions. Linda's face softened with understanding. She didn't say anything, just listened, giving him the space to continue. I eventually did pick him up, John went on, but the whole ride, I was making these stupid, judgmental comments, not knowing who he really was. And then, when I dropped him off, he handed me his business card. Turns out he's this big-time CEO, and all I could think about was how wrong I had been, how I had treated him like he was less than he was, just because of what I thought I knew. Linda's brow furrowed slightly, but she remained silent, letting John talk. He didn't yell at me, he didn't report me or try to get me in trouble, John continued, his voice growing more emotional. He just told me to do better. And now, I don't know. I don't know if I can. Linda reached across the table, taking John's hand in hers. You're already doing better, she said softly. You're thinking about it. You're questioning yourself. And that's a start. John looked at her, feeling the tears he had been holding back start to well up. He blinked them away, embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotion. It's just that I've been this way for so long, he said, his voice breaking slightly. How do you undo years of living like that? How do you change? Linda squeezed his hand gently. One step at a time, she said. You can't expect to change overnight, but the fact that you're willing to try, that's what matters. John swallowed hard, nodding, though he still felt unsure. The challenge of doing better seemed enormous, like a mountain he wasn't sure he could climb. But as he sat there with Linda, holding her hand, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do it alone. The following days were a whirlwind for John. With every ride he took, every passenger he picked up, he was acutely aware of the biases he had held onto for so long. The lessons from Marcus were fresh in his mind, and he was determined to approach each encounter with a newfound sense of respect and openness. Each passenger became a lesson in humility. There was the elderly woman who, despite her frail appearance, shared stories of her adventurous youth, how she had traveled the world as a young girl and fought against discrimination in her own life. There was the college student who had just landed an internship at a tech company and was bubbling with excitement, speaking passionately about his dreams and aspirations. With each interaction, John felt the walls he had built around himself start to crumble. He learned to listen rather than judge, to ask questions instead of making assumptions. It was a difficult transition, but one that filled him with purpose. John began to realize that he had been missing out on the richness of human connection. The stories his passengers shared were not just words. They were experiences, lessons, and reflections of their lives. And through their stories, John found a growing sense of empathy within himself. But the real test came one afternoon when John received a fare that sent a chill down his spine. The app pinged, and as he accepted the ride, he saw the destination. It was Marcus's office tower. John's heart raced. He hadn't seen Marcus since that fateful day, and now he was about to pick him up again. When he arrived at the tower, he felt a mix of dread and anticipation. The thought of facing Marcus again filled him with anxiety. Would he remember their last interaction? Would he see through John's attempts at change? John waited at the curb, trying to steady his nerves. He replayed their last conversation in his head, the way Marcus had calmly confronted him about his prejudices. He wanted to show Marcus that he was different now, that he had taken those words to heart. After what felt like an eternity, Marcus emerged from the building, his posture confident and assured. He spotted John's taxi and approached, a hint of surprise crossing his face when he recognized John. Hey, Marcus said as he got into the back seat. Hi, John replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Where to? Back to my apartment, please, Marcus said, his tone casual, but John could sense the underlying tension. As they drove, the silence felt heavy. John glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to gauge Marcus's mood. He looked composed, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps skepticism. John decided he needed to break the silence. I just wanted to say, I've been thinking a lot about our last ride, he started, his heart racing. About what you said. Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Oh, and what have you been thinking? John took a deep breath, steeling himself for the honesty that was about to come. I realized how wrong I was. I made assumptions about you without even knowing you. And I'm trying to change that. I want to do better. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. That's a start, but it's more than just words, you know. It's about action, what you do moving forward. I get that, John replied, his voice earnest. I've been trying to approach every ride differently. I want to see people for who they are, not what I assume they are. It's harder than I thought, but I'm committed to it. Marcus studied John for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read between the lines. It takes time. Change doesn't happen overnight. But if you're serious about it, that's the first step. John felt a surge of hope at Marcus's words. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance to prove himself, to show that he could be better. As they pulled up to Marcus's apartment, John parked the car and turned to face him. I appreciate you giving me another chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to make it right. Marcus opened the door but paused, looking back at John. You've already taken the first step. Just remember, it's a journey. Keep working at it and don't let the past define you. With that, Marcus stepped out of the taxi, leaving John with a renewed sense of determination. He watched Marcus walk away, a mixture of admiration and respect filling him. Driving away from the apartment complex, John felt lighter than he had in days. For the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He had a long way to go, but he was ready to face whatever came next, one passenger at a time. The next few weeks brought a noticeable shift in John's approach to driving. Each ride was no longer just a job. It became an opportunity for growth and connection. He found himself genuinely interested in the lives of his passengers, eager to hear their stories and learn from their experiences. It was a refreshing change from the monotony of his previous routine, and for the first time in years, John felt a sense of purpose, beyond just earning a paycheck. One afternoon, John picked up a middle-aged woman who was visibly upset. Her face was drawn and tears shimmered in her eyes as she settled into the back seat. Instantly, John sensed her distress, and rather than focusing solely on the road ahead, he turned the rear-view mirror to meet her gaze. Is everything okay? He asked gently. The woman sighed, and after a moment of hesitation, she began to speak. I just left the hospital, she said, her voice trembling. My sister has been diagnosed with cancer. We don't know how much time she has left. John felt a pang of sympathy wash over him. He knew how devastating such news could be. He had experienced loss in his own life. I'm really sorry to hear that, he said sincerely. If you want to talk about it, I'm here to listen. To his surprise, the woman took him up on the offer. She began sharing stories about her sister, recounting their childhood memories, their adventures, and the bond they had shared. John listened intently, offering supportive nods and murmurs of encouragement as she spoke. As she talked, John realized the importance of empathy and connection. This was more than just a fare. It was a moment to support someone in need. He understood now that everyone had their struggles, their burdens, and sometimes all it took was a listening ear to help lighten the load. By the time they reached her destination, the woman's tears had subsided, replaced by a faint smile. Thank you for listening, she said softly as she got out of the taxi. It really helped. John watched her walk away, feeling a warmth in his chest. It was moments like this that made him grateful for his job. It wasn't just about driving people from point A to point B, it was about being part of their lives, even if only for a brief moment. As he drove away, John reflected on how much he had changed in such a short period. He was no longer the man who passed by passengers without a second thought. He was becoming someone who cared, someone who understood the power of kindness. The next day, he had another significant encounter. He picked up a young college student named Sarah who was rushing to get to a job interview. As they drove, Sarah's nervousness was palpable. She fidgeted with her resume and repeatedly glanced at the clock, anxiety written all over her face. First interview? John asked, trying to ease the tension. Yes, Sarah replied, taking a deep breath. I really want this job. It's at a tech startup, and it would be such a great opportunity. John recognized the determination in her voice and felt compelled to offer some encouragement. You've got this, he said confidently. Just be yourself. They're going to see your potential. Sarah smiled weakly, but the worry still lingered in her eyes. I hope so. I've worked so hard for this. As they approached the destination, John decided to share a bit of his own story. You know, I've been doing this job for a long time. I never imagined I'd be a taxi driver. But sometimes life takes you on unexpected paths. What matters is how you handle the journey. Sarah turned to look at him, curiosity piqued. Really? What did you want to do? I had dreams of being a businessman when I was younger, John admitted. But life happened, and I lost my way for a bit. It took me a long time to realize that it's never too late to change. You just have to be willing to put in the effort. Wow, that's really inspiring, Sarah said as they pulled up to her interview location. Thank you for sharing that. Good luck in there, John said as she got out of the car. Just remember to believe in yourself. As Sarah rushed toward the building, John felt a renewed sense of hope. Each interaction he had, whether it was with someone grieving or a nervous job seeker, reminded him of the importance of connection and compassion. He realized that while he might not be changing the world in grand gestures, he was making a difference in small, meaningful ways. Days turned into weeks, and John continued to embrace this new perspective. With each ride, he found himself learning more about the people he encountered, each one with a story, each one deserving of respect and kindness. The lessons from Marcus remained at the forefront of his mind, guiding him through his interactions. But change wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments when old habits threatened to resurface. One day, John picked up a fare who seemed irritable. From the moment he got in the car, he was rude, dismissive, and made derogatory comments about the city and the people in it. For a moment, John felt the old defensive instinct to push back rise within him. He wanted to retort, to argue, to stand up against the negativity. But then he remembered Marcus's words. Instead of engaging in conflict, John took a deep breath and decided to focus on his job. Everyone has their own struggles, he reminded himself. You never know what someone else is going through. John remained calm and professional, choosing not to engage with the negativity. He let the passenger rant, and as they drove, he used the opportunity to reflect on his own growth. This man's words no longer had the power to shape John's reality. Instead, he chose to focus on the positive interactions he had experienced in recent weeks, the connections he had made, and the lessons he had learned. By the time they reached the destination, John felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had faced temptation, but had chosen a different path. As the passenger got out of the car, he grumbled a half-hearted, "Thanks." But John simply smiled, knowing he had made the right choice. With each passing day, John felt himself becoming more resilient, more empathetic, and more aware of the impact he could have on others. He was becoming the man he wanted to be, one ride at a time. As the weeks continued to pass, John found himself eagerly looking forward to each new day behind the wheel. His renewed sense of purpose brought a lightness to his heart that he hadn't felt in years. With each passenger he picked up, he felt more connected to the world around him and more determined to embrace the lessons he had learned from Marcus. One sunny afternoon, John received a fare that would push him even further along his journey of transformation. The app notified him of a pickup at a local community center, and as he arrived, he saw a crowd of people milling about. It looked like an event was taking place, and the energy in the air was palpable. A young girl, no older than 10, approached the taxi with a huge smile plastered across her face. She was holding a colorful poster board covered in drawings and vibrant colors. John couldn't help but smile back at her enthusiasm. "Are you my taxi?" the girl asked, her eyes sparkling. "Yep, that's me," John replied, chuckling at her excitement. "Where are we headed?" "Can you take me to the park? My mom said I could have a picnic with my friends after the art show," she exclaimed, practically bouncing in her seat. John adjusted his mirror to look at her properly as he pulled away from the community center. "Sounds fun. You're an artist?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Uh-huh. I made a drawing of my dog," she replied, beaming. "His name is Sparky, and he's the best dog in the whole world." John couldn't help but laugh. "I'm sure he is. Dogs have a way of being the best, don't they?" "Yes, and my drawing is super colorful. You'll love it, Yang," she insisted, her enthusiasm infectious. As they drove, the girl continued to chatter away about her art, her friends, and what she hoped to do when she grew up. She talked about wanting to be an artist or maybe a vet, and her dreams were full of energy and possibility. John listened intently, marveling at her optimism. He found himself reflecting on how often he had overlooked the simple joys in life, how he had let cynicism cloud his perspective. This little girl was a reminder of the innocence and creativity that exists in everyone, regardless of age or background. When they arrived at the park, the girl hopped out of the taxi, clutching her poster board tightly. "Thank you," she shouted, waving as she dashed off toward her friends, who were waiting nearby. John watched her go, a smile still on his face. It was moments like these that made his job worthwhile, reminders of the beauty in the world, even amid the chaos. As John drove away from the park, he felt a renewed sense of energy. He reflected on how the young girl's spirit had lifted his own. It was a stark contrast to the negativity he had encountered from some passengers in the past, and he realized that he had the power to choose how he responded to each situation. His next fare came in quickly, a woman in her late 30s who appeared to be in a hurry. She climbed into the back seat, breathless and slightly frazzled. "Can you take me to the airport, please? I'm running late," she said, urgency in her tone. "Of course," John replied, shifting into drive. "I'll get you there as quickly as I can." As they navigated through traffic, The woman's anxiety was palpable. She was checking her watch and tapping her foot against the floor. John could sense her stress and decided to do his best to ease it. "Everything's going to be fine," he said reassuringly. "You'll make your flight." The woman glanced up at him, surprised by his calm demeanor. "I hope so. I just can't believe I let myself get so behind this morning. It's been one of those days." "Trust me, I understand," John said, recalling his own struggles with time management and the pressures of life. "Sometimes it feels like the universe is conspiring against you, but it's how we deal with those moments that counts." She seemed to relax slightly, appreciating his words. "You're right. Thank you for being so understanding." As they reached the airport, John navigated the chaos of travelers and luggage, deftly maneuvering through the drop-off lane. When they finally pulled up, the woman exhaled in relief. "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it." "Good luck with your flight," John called as she hurried out of the taxi, a sense of accomplishment washing over him. It felt good to know he had made a positive impact on her day, however small. Every interaction was becoming a chance to connect, to support others, and to show kindness. John realized that being a taxi driver was more than just a job. It was a way to engage with the world and make a difference in people's lives. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, John found himself reflecting on his journey. He thought about Marcus and how that one ride had changed everything for him. He was grateful for the chance to grow, to confront his biases, and to become a better version of himself. But John also understood that this journey was ongoing. There would always be challenges, moments of doubt, and temptation to revert to old ways. He knew he had to stay vigilant, to remain aware of his thoughts and actions. As he finished his shift that evening, John drove home feeling lighter than he had in a long time. The weight of guilt and shame had begun to lift, replaced by a sense of hope and purpose. He was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that change was a continuous journey, one he was now committed to traveling. The following morning brought with it a renewed sense of determination for John. As he prepared for another day of driving, he felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The previous weeks had been transformative, but he understood that the journey was far from over. After a quick breakfast with Linda and Eric, John headed out to the taxi depot, ready to face whatever the day had in store. As he drove through the city, he was struck by how vibrant everything felt. The sun was shining, people were bustling about, and there was a palpable energy in the air. John accepted his first fare of the day, a group of college students heading to a local art festival. As they piled into the back seat, the energy was infectious. They were laughing and joking, excited about the day ahead. John couldn't help but smile as he drove, their enthusiasm reminding him of the young girl from the other day. "Are you going to the festival too?" one of the students asked. John shook his head. "Just working today, but it sounds like fun. Yeah, you should check it out. There are going to be some amazing artists there," another student chimed in. "I'm sure it will be great," John replied, feeling a sense of longing. He wished he could join them, to experience the creativity and community they spoke of. But he also knew he had a responsibility to his family and his job. As they drove, the conversation flowed easily, with the students sharing their hopes and dreams for the future. John found himself engaged, asking questions and encouraging them to share more. It felt good to connect, to be part of their excitement, even for a brief moment. When they arrived at the festival, the students thanked him enthusiastically, and one of them handed John a flyer for the event. "You should come by. It's going to be awesome." "Maybe I will," John said, genuinely meaning it. He watched as they hurried off, their laughter echoing in the air, and he felt a warmth in his heart. The rest of the day continued in a similar vein. John picked up passengers of all kinds, an elderly couple on their way to a doctor's appointment, a businessman rushing to a meeting, a mother with 2 young children in tow. Each interaction was different, but John found himself approaching every ride with the same openness and willingness to connect. One passenger stood out, a young black woman who climbed into the cab with an air of determination. As she settled into the back seat, John noticed the way she carried herself, confident, assertive, and ready to tackle whatever lay ahead. "Where to?" John asked. "Downtown, please. I have an interview, and I'm running a bit late," she replied, her voice steady but with an undertone of urgency. "Got it. We'll get you there on time," John said, shifting into drive. As they navigated through the busy streets, the woman began to share her story. "I've been working hard to prepare for this opportunity," she said, her excitement evident. "It's a big step for me, and I really want to make a good impression." John could hear the determination in her voice. "That's great to hear. What position are you applying for?" he asked, genuinely interested. "I'm interviewing for a project manager role at a tech company," she replied, her eyes shining with ambition. It's a dream job for me, and I've worked so hard to get to this point. That's fantastic, John encouraged. I know you'll do great. Just be yourself. She smiled, but her expression turned serious. It's not always easy, you know. As a black woman in this industry, I often feel like I have to prove myself more than others. It can be exhausting. John nodded, understanding the weight of her words. I can't imagine how challenging that must be. But just remember that your skills and qualifications speak for themselves. Don't let anyone's biases hold you back. The woman looked at John, her surprise evident. Thank you for saying that. It's nice to have someone in my corner, even if it's just for this ride. As they approached the interview location, John felt a surge of pride for the connection they had built during the drive. It reminded him of his own journey, of the lessons he was learning about respect and understanding. When they arrived, the woman thanked him sincerely, and John wished her the best of luck as she exited the cab. "You've got this," he called after her, a genuine smile on his face. Driving away, John felt invigorated. Each ride was reinforcing the idea that everyone had a story, a struggle, and a dream worth pursuing. He had been given a second chance to see the world through a more compassionate lens, and he was determined to embrace it fully. As the day progressed, John's positivity continued to grow. He engaged with his passengers, listened to their stories, and shared bits of encouragement when appropriate. He felt alive, more in tune with the world around him than ever before. But as he picked up more passengers, John also understood that not everyone would be receptive to kindness. He had learned that not everyone shared his newfound outlook on life. There were still moments of tension, but he felt better equipped to handle them. He was becoming more resilient, more patient. Later in the day, John received a fare from a man who immediately seemed annoyed when he entered the cab. He grumbled about the wait time and made a snide comment about the weather. John felt the familiar urge to defend himself rise within him, but instead he took a deep breath and reminded himself of the journey he was on. "Good afternoon," John said, keeping his tone neutral. The man grunted in response, arms crossed as he glared out the window. John decided not to engage. Instead, he focused on the road, allowing the man's negativity to wash over him rather than seep in. As they drove, John felt a sense of clarity. This man was entitled and rude, but John didn't have to let his attitude dictate his own feelings. He continued to drive, taking deep breaths and letting the man's complaints roll off his back. When they arrived at the destination, the man threw a crumpled bill into the front seat without even looking at John. "Thanks," he muttered, sounding more irritated than grateful. "Have a good day," John replied. And as the man stepped out, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had faced the negativity without allowing it to bring him down. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the city, John realized that he was learning to navigate life's challenges with grace. Each passenger, whether kind or rude, was an opportunity for growth, a chance to practice empathy and understanding. Driving home that evening, John felt lighter. He was still on a journey of transformation, but he was embracing the process. He was becoming a better man, one ride at a time. The following days continued to be a whirlwind of new experiences for John. Each ride brought its own set of challenges and opportunities for connection, and he found himself increasingly motivated to engage with his passengers, to see beyond the surface, and understand their stories. One afternoon, as he picked up a fare from a local hospital, he encountered a nurse named Angela. She climbed into the back seat, looking worn out from a long shift. Her scrubs were slightly rumpled, and dark circles lingered under her eyes, but she managed a small smile when she saw John. "Hey there," she said, her voice warm despite her exhaustion. "Hi, where to today?" John asked as he pulled away from the hospital. "Just take me home, please," Angela replied, leaning back in her seat. "I can't wait to finally relax." John could see the weight of the day pressing on her. "Long shift?" he asked, genuinely interested. "Yeah, you could say that. We've been short-staffed, so it's been pretty hectic," she explained, running a hand through her hair. "I love my job, but some days it feels like I'm running on fumes." "Must be tough," John said, nodding. "But what you do is so important. You're making a real difference in people's lives." Angela's expression softened at his words. "Thanks, I appreciate that. It can be hard to remember that sometimes, especially when the days drag on." As they drove, John listened intently as Angela shared stories from her day. She talked about a patient she had been caring for, a young boy who had undergone surgery and was now recovering. Her passion for her work shone through as she described the challenges and triumphs of her role. "I just want to make sure every patient feels cared for," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. It's not just about treating their physical ailments. It's about their emotional well-being too. John found himself inspired by Angela's dedication. It reminded him of his own journey, how he had been given a chance to do better, to show kindness in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. As they neared her home, Angela glanced out the window and sighed. "I can't wait to get home and have a cup of tea," she said, her eyes reflecting a longing for rest. It's the little things that make the long days worth it. When they arrived, Angela reached for her purse, but John stopped her. "No, let me get that for you," he offered, stepping out of the cab to help her with the door. Angela looked surprised but smiled gratefully. "Thank you, that's so kind of you." As she exited the car, John couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in himself. It was a simple gesture, but it was a step toward being the kind of person he wanted to be, someone who treated others with respect and kindness, no matter their circumstances. "Take care of yourself and enjoy your tea," John called as she walked away, and Angela turned back, her smile brightening the dim evening light. "I will. Thanks again," she replied, waving goodbye. Driving away, John reflected on the interaction. He felt a growing sense of purpose in his work. Each passenger he encountered was an opportunity to practice empathy, to make a difference in their day, no matter how small. But even as he embraced this newfound outlook, John knew that the road to change was not always smooth. There were still moments that tested his resolve. He was reminded of this during another fair later that week. He picked up a group of friends celebrating a birthday, and as they climbed into the back seat, the atmosphere was jovial and loud. They were laughing, joking, and the energy was infectious. John smiled as they shared their excitement, but as the ride progressed, the tone shifted. One of the friends, a guy named Jake, began making inappropriate jokes about a nearby bar that catered to a more diverse crowd. "I wouldn't be caught dead in that place," he laughed, and the others chimed in with similar sentiments. At first, John felt the old defensive instinct rise within him, the urge to engage and challenge their prejudices. But he remembered Marcus's words about not letting negativity dictate his feelings. Instead, he took a deep breath and focused on the road. "Why not?" John asked casually, trying to steer the conversation in a different direction. "What's wrong with it?" Jake looked at John in the rearview mirror, surprised by the question. "You know, it's just not my scene," he replied dismissively. "I prefer places that don't have all those people." John felt the familiar surge of frustration but remained calm. "You might be missing out. Sometimes those people have some great stories to tell." The group fell silent for a moment, and John could sense the tension in the air. He felt a mix of anger and disappointment. This wasn't what he wanted to encounter. He had hoped to share positivity, not engage with prejudice. "Whatever, man," Jake said, shrugging off John's comment as they neared their destination. "It's just how I feel." John stayed silent as they arrived at the bar. The group hopped out, still laughing, and John took a moment to collect himself. He had faced negativity, but he had also taken a stand without engaging in an argument. Driving away from the bar, John reflected on the encounter. He realized that not everyone would be receptive to kindness or understanding, but that didn't mean he had to let their attitudes affect him. He could choose how to respond, and he could choose to remain committed to his journey of growth. The sun was setting as John drove through the streets, the city bathed in golden light. He felt a sense of resolve settle within him. The road to change would be filled with challenges, but he was ready to face them. He pulled into his driveway that evening, feeling a mixture of fatigue and fulfillment. He had learned that every ride was a lesson, and every passenger had the potential to teach him something new. As he walked into the house, Linda looked up from the kitchen. "How was your day?" she asked, her smile brightening the room. "Good," John replied, feeling the warmth of home wrap around him. "I had some interesting rides today. Care to share?" she asked, curiosity sparkling in her eyes. John took a deep breath, feeling grateful for the opportunity to open up. "Yeah, actually, one was with a nurse who really inspired me, and another was, well, it was a challenge." Linda nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I realize that not everyone sees the world the way I do," John said, his voice thoughtful. "But that's okay. I can still choose how I respond to it." As he shared his day with Linda, he felt the weight of his journey lift just a little more. He was becoming a better man, one interaction at a time. The next morning, John woke up feeling hopeful. His conversations with Linda had opened a new door for him, a door that allowed him to share his thoughts and experiences without fear of judgment. The previous day's rides had also left him feeling invigorated and inspired, and he was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. As he prepared for his shift, John made a conscious decision to approach each passenger with curiosity and empathy. He wanted to be intentional about seeing the humanity in everyone who got into his taxi, regardless of their background or attitude. The day started off well. John picked up a young couple heading to a nearby museum. They were excitedly discussing their plans for the day, and John found himself drawn into their enthusiasm. He engaged them in conversation about the exhibits they were hoping to see, and their faces lit up with excitement as they shared their interests in art and history. After dropping them off, John felt a sense of fulfillment. It was these simple moments of connection that made the job rewarding. He had spent so many years focused solely on the fare and the drive, but now he was discovering the joy in connecting with people. As the day progressed, John picked up a diverse range of passengers: a businesswoman rushing to an important meeting, a grandmother taking her grandchildren to the park, and even a local musician heading to a gig. With each interaction, he embraced the opportunity to listen, learn, and empathize. However, as the afternoon wore on, John received a fare that brought him face to face with his past prejudices in a way he hadn't anticipated. He pulled up to a bustling downtown street where a young black man was waiting at the curb. As he climbed into the back seat, John immediately recognized the defensive posture and guarded expression on his face. The man was dressed in casual clothes but carried himself with an air of hesitation, as if he were used to being judged. "Where to?" John asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Just take me to the other side of town," the man replied curtly, avoiding eye contact. John sensed the tension and felt a familiar pang of concern. It reminded him of the old days when he would have dismissed someone based on their demeanor. But today, he was committed to changing that. As they drove, John noticed the man's nervousness intensifying. He shifted in his seat, glancing out the window, and John felt the urge to break the silence. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm. The man turned his gaze to John, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, but his tone didn't match his words. "Just checking," John replied. "I know sometimes rides can be stressful. I'm here to help." The man sighed, a mix of frustration and weariness. "I'm just dealing with a lot right now," he admitted, finally allowing a glimpse of vulnerability. "Trying to find a job and you know how it is." John nodded, understanding the struggle. "I do. It can be tough out there. But don't lose hope. You never know when the right opportunity might come along." The man looked at John, an eyebrow raised. "You really think so?" "I know so," John replied, his tone sincere. "I've been through my share of challenges too. Just keep pushing forward." For a moment, the man seemed to consider John's words. "Thanks," he said quietly. "It's just hard to stay positive sometimes." "I get that," John said, recalling his own journey of self-discovery and the lessons he had learned. "But remember, it's okay to ask for help. You don't have to do it alone." As they approached their destination, John felt a connection growing between them. It wasn't just about the ride. It was about understanding, sharing experiences, and building a bridge between their two worlds. When they arrived, the man turned to John, a flicker of appreciation in his eyes. "Thanks for the talk. I really needed that." "Anytime," John replied, feeling a warmth in his chest. "You've got this." As the man got out of the taxi, John felt a sense of fulfillment. This was what he had been striving for: genuine connection, empathy, and the courage to face the truth about himself and others. The rest of the day brought a variety of passengers, each with their own stories, but John was beginning to feel more grounded in his role. He was learning to navigate the complexities of human connection, embracing the fact that everyone has their own struggles and triumphs. But the most impactful moment came later in the week when John was called to pick up a fare from a local shelter. As he arrived, he noticed a group of people waiting outside, each with a unique story etched into their faces. When a young woman climbed into the back seat, John could immediately sense her fragility. She looked exhausted, her clothes worn, and her eyes filled with a sadness that struck a chord in him. "Where to?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. "Just drop me off at the library," she replied quietly, her gaze fixed on her lap. As they drove, John felt a pull to reach out. "How's your day going?" he asked, genuinely interested. The woman sighed, and after a moment, she began to open up. "I've been looking for work, but it's tough. I'm just trying to get back on my feet." John nodded, feeling a deep empathy for her situation. "I understand. It can be really hard out there. But don't give up hope. There are people who care and want to help." "Thanks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I appreciate that." As they approached the library, John felt a surge of inspiration. He realized that these moments of connection were what made his job meaningful. It wasn't just about the fare. It was about being a part of someone's journey, even if just for a brief moment. When they arrived, the young woman turned to John, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you for listening. It really helps to talk about it." Anytime, John replied, feeling a warmth spread through him. You're stronger than you think. Just keep pushing forward. As she stepped out of the taxi, John felt a sense of accomplishment wash over him. He was becoming a better version of himself, one ride at a time, and each passenger reminded him of the beauty and complexity of life. With each interaction, he learned to embrace empathy and understanding, becoming more aware of the impact he could have on others. He realized that he was not only changing himself, but also fostering a sense of connection in a world that often felt divided. Driving home that evening, John reflected on the week's encounters. He felt grateful for the chance to grow, to learn, and to connect. And as he pulled into his driveway, he knew he was on the right path, one that would lead him to a more compassionate future. The following week, John's resolve to change and connect with his passengers only deepened. With each ride, he approached his work with intention and purpose, embracing the opportunity to make a positive impact on those he encountered. One day, as he drove through the city, he received a fare request that piqued his interest. A pickup from a local community center where a youth mentoring program was taking place. John arrived to find a group of teenagers gathered outside, their energy palpable as they chatted and laughed. As he stepped out of the taxi to meet his passenger, a tall young man with a confident demeanor approached. "You John?" he asked, his voice firm. "Yeah, that's me," John replied, feeling a rush of excitement. "Cool, I'm Malik," the young man said, shaking John's hand. "I'm heading to a meeting with some mentors. You ready?" "Absolutely," John said, smiling. "Let's go." As they drove, Malik began sharing his excitement about the mentoring program. "I'm part of this initiative to help young people in the community find their path. It's been life-changing," he said, his enthusiasm contagious. "That's amazing," John replied, genuinely impressed. "What do you do as a mentor?" "I help younger kids navigate their challenges, whether it's school, family issues, or just life in general," Malik explained. "It's important to show them they have options, that they can achieve their dreams." John felt a surge of admiration for Malik's passion. "That's incredible. You're making a real difference." "Thanks. It's not always easy, but when you see a kid's eyes light up because they finally understand something, it's worth it," Malik said, his voice filled with conviction. As they drove through the city, John found himself reflecting on the importance of mentorship and community. It reminded him of his own journey and how the kindness of others had helped him along the way. When they arrived at the community center, Malik turned to John with gratitude. "Thanks for the ride. I appreciate it." "No problem at all," John replied. "Keep up the great work. You're doing something special." As Malik stepped out, John felt inspired. He realized that every interaction he had was a chance to spread positivity, to be a part of something greater than himself. Later that week, John found himself reflecting on how far he had come. He had transformed from a man who made snap judgments to someone who sought to understand the stories behind every face. Each passenger brought a new lesson, and with each ride he was learning to embrace empathy, connection, and kindness. But it wasn't all easy. One afternoon, he picked up a fare from a bar, and the passenger, a middle-aged man, was visibly intoxicated. As soon as he climbed into the back seat, he began to rant about everything that was wrong with the world, politics, the economy, and society in general. John's heart sank. He had faced negativity before, but this felt different. The man's anger was palpable, and he could feel the tension in the air. "Where to?" John asked, trying to remain calm. "Just take me home," the man grumbled, his voice thick with frustration. As they drove, John felt the urge to defend himself and challenge the man's pessimistic worldview. But he remembered his commitment to change. Instead of engaging with the negativity, he decided to keep the conversation light. "Rough day?" John asked, trying to find common ground. The man scoffed. "You could say that. The world's gone to hell, and nobody cares." John stayed quiet for a moment, then replied, "You know, it can feel overwhelming sometimes, but there are still good things happening out there." The man shot him a glare through the rearview mirror. "What good? All I see is chaos." John took a deep breath, resisting the urge to argue. "Well, I think it's important to focus on the positives, even when it feels tough. Sometimes, it's the little things that matter." For a moment, the man fell silent, contemplating John's words. Then he huffed, "What do you know? You're just a taxi driver." John felt the familiar sting of defensiveness, but reminded himself of his journey. "True, but I get to meet people from all walks of life. Each one has their own story, their own struggles. I see the impact of kindness every day." The man shifted in his seat, seeming to reconsider his stance. You really believe that?" "I do," John replied earnestly. "I've seen how small gestures can change someone's day. You'd be surprised at the difference it makes." As they neared the man's home, he fell silent, his expression softening just a little. "Maybe you're right," he said finally, a hint of vulnerability breaking through his bravado. When they arrived, the man handed John a generous tip, surprising him. "Thanks for the ride," he muttered, almost sheepishly. "Take care of yourself," John said, hoping his words would resonate. As the man walked away, John felt a mix of relief and satisfaction. He had faced negativity, but had chosen not to let it affect him. Instead, he had stood his ground, demonstrating that kindness could still exist even in the face of anger. The rest of the week was filled with similar encounters. Some passengers were open and engaging, while others were closed off and defensive. But each interaction became an opportunity for John to practice empathy, and he found himself growing more resilient with each ride. One evening, he picked up a father and his young daughter. The little girl was shy at first, but as they drove, she began to warm up to John, showing him her drawings and talking about her love for art. "Wow, you're really talented," John said, genuinely impressed. "I bet you're going to be an amazing artist one day." The girl beamed, her confidence growing with every word. "I want to paint a big mural one day, with lots of colors." As John dropped them off, he felt a sense of fulfillment. These moments, these small connections, were what made his job worthwhile. He realized he was not just driving people, he was helping them connect with their dreams and aspirations, even if just for a short ride. Driving home that night, John reflected on his journey. He had faced challenges, encountered negativity, and grappled with his own biases. But through it all, he had found a deeper understanding of himself and others. As he pulled into his driveway, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He was becoming the person he wanted to be, one ride, one interaction at a time. As the sun rose on the final day of the week, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent the past few weeks embracing the changes in his life, and the journey had transformed him in ways he had never anticipated. He knew today would be different. With each ride, he felt more confident in his ability to connect with others, to approach every interaction with empathy and kindness. He was ready to face whatever challenges came his way. The morning started off strong. John picked up a young woman who was on her way to a local university. She was nervous, preparing for an important presentation. As they drove, she opened up about her fears and ambitions. John listened attentively, offering words of encouragement and reminding her to believe in herself. "You're going to do great," he assured her as they arrived at the university. "Just remember to breathe and be yourself." "Thank you, I really appreciate it," she said, a genuine smile spreading across her face. As she stepped out of the car, John felt a familiar warmth in his heart. Each interaction was reinforcing his commitment to this new way of being. He was no longer the man who had rushed past passengers, judging them without a second thought. He was learning to appreciate the richness of each person's story. The day continued, filled with passengers from all walks of life. There was the elderly man who shared stories of his adventures during the war, the couple celebrating their anniversary, and the single mother navigating the challenges of balancing work and family. With each ride, John was reminded of the resilience of the human spirit. But as the afternoon wore on, John received a fare request that sent a jolt of recognition through him. He had been called to pick up a passenger at the same office tower where he had first met Marcus. Anxiety bubbled up inside him as he approached the building, memories flooding back. As he parked and waited, John felt a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. He wondered if he would run into Marcus again. And if he did, what he would say. Would he be able to show how much he had changed? Would Marcus recognize the growth in him? A moment later, a familiar figure stepped out of the office building, Marcus. He looked up as he approached the taxi, a smile breaking across his face when he recognized John. "Hey, it's good to see you again," Marcus said as he climbed into the back seat. "Good to see you too," John replied, feeling a rush of emotions. "How have you been?" "Busy, but good," Marcus replied, his tone relaxed. "I've been working on some new projects for the company. How about you?" John felt a surge of pride as he shared his experiences since their last encounter. "I've been working on doing better, really trying to connect with my passengers and see the world from their perspective." Marcus listened intently, nodding as John spoke. "That's great to hear. Change is hard, but it sounds like you're making progress." "Thanks," John said, feeling the weight of his journey reflected in Marcus's words. "It hasn't been easy, but I'm committed to it." As they drove through the city, John felt a renewed sense of connection with Marcus. They shared stories and insights about life, and John felt a sense of gratitude for the opportunity to have met him. Marcus's challenge had sparked a fire in John, and it was illuminating the path forward. When they arrived at Marcus's destination, John parked the taxi and turned to face him. "I just wanted to thank you for that day, how you handled everything. It changed me," he said earnestly. Marcus smiled, his expression warm. I'm glad to hear that. You took the challenge to heart, and that's what matters. As Marcus stepped out of the taxi, John felt a sense of closure wash over him. He had faced his past, learned from it, and emerged stronger. He watched as Marcus walked away, feeling proud of the man he was becoming. The rest of the day unfolded smoothly, with passengers coming and going, each ride filled with new conversations and connections. John felt more alive than ever, and the challenges he had faced seemed small compared to the growth he had achieved. As he pulled into his driveway that evening, he took a moment to reflect on his journey. He had transformed from a man consumed by judgment to someone who embraced empathy, connection, and kindness. Walking into the house, he was greeted by Linda and Eric, who were bustling around the kitchen preparing dinner. John felt a wave of warmth wash over him as he joined them. "Hey, how was your day?" Linda asked, glancing up with a smile. "Good, really good, actually," John replied, his heart full. He shared snippets of his rides, the stories he had heard, and the connections he had made. As he spoke, he realized that the journey of change was not just about him. It was about the impact he could have on those around him. Every person he encountered had the potential to teach him something new, and every moment of connection brought him closer to the person he wanted to be. That night, as John lay in bed, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had faced his past and was ready to embrace the future. Change was a continuous journey, one he was committed to traveling for the long haul. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that with each new day came new opportunities to connect, to grow, and to truly understand the beauty of the human experience.